being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. All right. And we've looked at 4 arguments now for God's existence. And somebody tell me, what is the one-sentence summary of our first argument for God's existence, the contingency argument? Megan?
God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe.
Yeah, good. God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe. We saw that the universe exists, and the fact that the universe exists demands an explanation. And the only possible explanation for the universe existing is God. And somebody tell me, what is the one-sentence summary of the cosmological argument? Yes, William?
God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe.
Good. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. Not only does our universe exist, but it has a beginning. And once you have a beginning, then you also need a cause. And we saw by looking at the universe itself that the cause of the universe has all of the traditional attributes of God, and so must be God. The third argument that we looked at was the teleological argument. Somebody tell me, what is the one-sentence summary of the teleological argument? Yes, Jeannie.
God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for life.
Good. God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for life. We saw that our universe's constants and quantities are balanced on a knife's edge. They have the perfect values needed for life to exist in the universe. And we saw that there were 3 possible explanations for the fine-tuning of the universe, either physical necessity, chance, or design. Nobody endorses physical necessity. Chance doesn't have a chance, which means that it must be due to design, which means there must be a designer. And then last week, we looked at the moral argument. And for our review today, I am okay with slowing down and taking our time on this one, because we did the whole moral argument in one class. And so now you guys have had a week to think about it and chew on it. And if there's any questions about the moral argument, now would be the best time to get them out. Because if you have a question, there's probably somebody else in the room that has a question too. Let's go ahead and start off with the one-sentence summary. Somebody tell me, what is the one-sentence summary of the moral argument? Yes, Cherry.
God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values.
Good. God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. We saw that the syllogism for the moral argument goes like this. Nope, I can't bring those up. There is a problem with my PowerPoint. There he goes. Number 1, moral values and duties are objective if and only if God exists. Number 2, moral values and duties are objective. 3, therefore, God exists. And we started with premise 2 of this argument. First, I said we wanted to establish the fact that moral values and duties are objective, that there is an objective moral standard out there. And then we took a look at premise 1 and explored all of the possible bases for an objective moral standard. What basis could there possibly be that would make morality objective? And before we started with premise 2, we made a few distinctions. And one distinction that we made was the difference between objective and subjective. So can somebody tell me, what does objective mean? What do we mean when we say that morality is objective? Yes, Anne?
It's real or true, independent of anyone's opinion.
Yeah, good. Objective means real or true, independent of anyone's opinion about it. So when we say that morality is objective, we say that morality exists objectively. It's like an object that really exists, and it doesn't change based on what people think about it. So premise 1 has to do with the objectivity of morality. Premise 2, the first premise that we looked at, premise 2, has to do with the objectivity of morality. It states that moral values and duties are objective. And I have to make a correction from last week, because when I taught this last week, I said that I was going to give you guys a defense of premise 2. And that's not entirely accurate. What I taught last week was not a defense of premise 2. Really, last week I told you guys that everybody already believes that morality is objective, and I just explained why. So what I taught last week is not something that you would use to convince someone else that morality is objective. I'm saying that you shouldn't have to convince anybody else that morality is objective. Everybody already believes it, and here's why. So it's not a defense of premise 2. You shouldn't have to defend premise 2. People already believe that moral values and duties are objective. And does anybody remember what I said about that? How is it that everybody knows that moral values and duties are objective? So I made the case that the objectivity of moral values and duties are a certain type of belief. Does anybody remember what the term that I used last week for that type of belief, Anne?
Properly.
Yeah, very good. The objectivity of morality is a properly basic belief. Now, does anybody remember what a properly basic belief is? Yes, Cherry.
Rational, that can't provide proof, but justified through your experience.
Yeah, very good. So a properly basic belief is a belief that you come to hold through experience. And a very good example of a properly basic belief would be the existence of the external world. There is nothing that we can do to prove that the external world actually exists. You could just be a brain in a vat being stimulated to experience an external world. And there's nothing that you can do to prove otherwise. But that doesn't make the belief in the external world irrational. You're perfectly justified in believing that the external world exists through your experience. When our experience of a thing leads us to believe that that thing exists, we are justified in believing that that thing exists. And that applies to the external world. So when I go outside and I see a tree with my eyes or I feel a tree with my hands, I am justified in believing that that tree exists simply because I experienced it. And in the same way, when we have moral experiences, sometimes when we think about murder and we sense in our heart that murder is objectively wrong, we are sensing something real out there. There's a real moral standard out there that we are sensing with our hearts. And when we think about those moral experiences that we have, those experiences lead us to believe that morality is objective. And when our experiences lead us to believe that something exists, then we are justified in believing that it exists. Any questions on that aspect of the objectivity of morality? Somebody told me last week that when I gave this explanation of why people already believe that morality is objective, that it sounded circular to them. And I hope that that's still not the case for anybody. Is there anybody who still feels like I'm arguing in a circle here? All right, good. So that's reason number one, that you shouldn't have to convince anybody that morality is objective. People already believe it based on our experience. And then I gave one more reason to show that you shouldn't have to convince anybody else that morality is objective. William, you know what that was? Yeah, very good. Moral relativism is abhorrent. We saw that when somebody expresses the view that there are no objective moral truths, then they are endorsing moral relativism. They would say that there is no objective moral standard, and when they do that, they lose the ability to condemn anything. And we gave the example of child abuse. The moral relativist doesn't have the ability to condemn child abuse because, on their view, nothing is really wrong. Only some people think some things are wrong, but there's nothing really wrong with anything. And such a position is just gross to most people. You'll find that some people do give lip service to moral relativism, but you can very quickly persuade people that, oh yeah, okay, moral values and duties are objective after all, just by giving examples of moral atrocities. And you can get most people to admit, okay, yeah, I do believe that moral values and duties are objective. Any questions or discussion on that point? All right, so premise 2 of the argument isn't one that you should really even have to persuade people of. Everybody already believes it, and this is why. So then we took a look at premise 1, which states that moral values and duties are objective if and only if God exists. Premise 1 states that God is the only possible basis for an objective morality. The basis that for morality that most atheists commonly endorse is called humanism. Does anybody remember what the definition of humanism is? What is humanism? So humanism is the view that whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from human flourishing is bad. So they're saying that the basis for morality is what is best for human flourishing. And does anybody remember what I said the problem was with such a basis for morality? What's wrong with humanism? Yes, Anne. Why just humans? Okay. Humanism, at best, leads only to a subjective morality, not an objective morality. Because why say that what contributes to human flourishing is any more valuable than the flourishing of any other animal, like ants or mice or mushrooms for that matter? Humanism leads you to a subjective morality at best. In order to have an objective morality, you're gonna have to have a God. It's gonna have to be the character of the creator of the universe. Yes, Gabby? Say again?
So also if you didn't care for the animals or also materials, homes, food is gone, it's also degrades the world.
Yeah, that's true. We do have to take care of our world, don't we? Yes?
So if you're discrediting or not in favor of humanism, then wouldn't the or reductio reductum ad absurdum argument that you're making also need to be thrown out? Because we see in animals the idea of abandoning your child, eating your child, a lot of horrific things that we would not want to establish as okay. If we're looking at animals as well, what basis would we have for saying morals are objective?
So the fact that other animals have show moral codes of their own, so they have like kind of a herd morality, actually goes to show my point. Homo sapiens are not the only animals that have a herd morality. There's also chimpanzees and baboons and dogs and gazelles. They all have their own herd morality. What is it that would make the morality that was evolved by humans any more objective than any of those other animals' morality? All of those moralities would be subjective moralities. The only possible basis for an objective morality would be the character of the creator of the universe.
So then how does that establish that there are multiple subjective moralities, that there is even an objective moral?
So the fact that there is an objective morality is premise 2. So premise 2 is what we use to establish that there is an objective morality. Premise 1 explores the possible bases for an objective morality.
Right. Sorry. I get that. I'm saying if you're throwing out humanism, then your claim to favor premise 2 should also be thrown out. Am I incorrect?
Why is that?
Because the idea of animals having horrific instances in their morals does not compute for our idea that we have objective morals because we think whatever murder of child abuse is.
Are you saying because animals don't follow the objective morality, that means that there isn't an objective morality?
No. We can have a discussion.
All right, sounds good. I appreciate the discussion, though. Thank you. Yes, Barry?
Could we say that as humans, we think, we process things, and we come to a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
But we do it subjectively until we intersect to the objective, the truth,
Mm-hmm.
such as your tree.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and we come in contact with the truth or the tree, and now we're objective.
Correct.
We're intersecting into what, and then when we talk about morality and God, that's the whole point. We are subjective outside of God. Until we come into intersection with God and line up with His standards, we are still subjective.
Yeah, good. So again, this is premise 2. Everything that we experience subjectively, right? Every experience is subjective to yourself. You can't share experiences with other people. But your subjective experiences of a thing, if your subjective experiences of a thing leads you to believe that that thing actually exists, then you are justified in believing that that thing actually exists. Yes, Barry?
But only if it's true.
Right. Yep.
Right? I mean, you can have experiences and come to a false conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and it not be true.
Yeah.
So you're still subjective.
Yeah, in the absence of a defeater, the things that we experience as being real, we are justified in believing are real. Yeah. All right, so premise 2, morality is objective, and we all know it, and you shouldn't have to convince anybody otherwise. Premise 1 says the only possible basis for that objective morality is God. The basis that the atheist embraces only leads to a subjective morality, not an objective morality. And then last week, we took a look at the Euthyphro dilemma, which seeks to show that God isn't a very good basis for an objective morality either, by asking the question, is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? Did God arbitrarily decide what was going to be good, or is what is good already exist and God looks at it and says, oh, that's good? On the one hand, if God arbitrarily decides what is good, that means that God could have picked anything. Like He could have told us that we ought to hate one another. And that just seems crazy, that we'd be morally obligated to hate one another. But on the other side, if God looks to something else and says that is what is good, that makes morality objective outside of God, which is totally against everything that we just talked about in premise 1. So, which is it? Ed?
Well, from a Christian standpoint, the answer is really pretty easy. God looked at His creation and said it was very good. Was there anything bad in it? No. So whatever God deems as good, it's because what He created was good. He didn't create anything bad.
Okay.
So from the standpoint, it would have to be it's something good because God wills it. Yes, God built it that way, designed it that way, created it that way.
Okay. Linda?
God wills something because He's good.
Be-
It's His very nature.
It's His very nature. Good. We'll get to that in just a second. Did you have something, Megan? Okay, so that was the same thing. Yeah, so I would say that we don't have to pick either one of these options. It's a false dilemma. There is a third option, the one that Linda and Megan just suggested. God wills something because He is good. God's nature is the very standard of goodness. God is love. And so the things that are like Him are what is good. And then God's commandments necessarily flow out of His nature. So God didn't arbitrarily decide that loving one another would be a good thing to do. Nor does He look at love and say, yeah, that's a good thing. No, God is love. And so when God tells us to love one another, He's just saying, be like me. Do the things that I would do. Emulate my nature. And His commands necessarily flow from that nature. Any questions or discussion on that concept? All right. So once again, premise 1, moral values and duties are objective if and only if God exists. God is the only possible basis for an objective morality. 2, moral values and duties are objective, and we all know it. Therefore, 3, God exists. Any final questions or discussion on the moral argument? Yes, Ed?
The only real problem you run into is that expects people to be honest. And
That's
people,
right.
a lot of times, if they're coming from a subjective morality, they face the truth, usually they'll deny it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they cease being honest about it.
Yeah, you are going to find hardliners who insist that premise 2 is false, that there really is no objective morality. And there's really not a lot you can do to persuade such a person. But their position is usually seen to be so extreme that other people are repulsed by it. And so they're not typically people that, or that position isn't typically one that most people follow. All right, so new material. We have now looked at 4 very powerful arguments for God's existence, and together they make a very strong cumulative case. But on the other hand, we also need to consider arguments against God's existence. It's not enough that there are good arguments for God's existence. We want to know where the balance of the evidence lies. Maybe there are equally good and equally powerful arguments on the other side of the scale against God's existence. Maybe those arguments even tip the scale in the other direction. So tonight we're going to look at what the atheist has to say and what his arguments are against God's existence. Yes, JC?
So I know it would fall under your defeater, but coming to that defeater, if your knowledge, your objective life experience shows you that murder is not wrong, how do you come to that knowledge if you haven't come to a knowledge of God? Kind of as Barry brought up, that in my mind, this is true. This is fact. So when do I know that I've attained enough knowledge to cement that as an objective fact versus continuing to seek out more knowledge to find out if it is in fact a fact?
So again, I would say when our experience of a thing causes us to believe that that thing exists objectively, then we are justified in believing that it does exist objectively. So when you've reached that point in which you believe that it exists objectively, then you are justified in believing that. And so you gave an example of somebody, if they actually came to the belief that murder is not wrong, they are justified in believing that. But they're not right. What the moral law actually says is a matter of perception and interpretation and deduction, and we don't always get it right. The person who literally honestly thinks that murder is not wrong has a moral impairment. We call them psychotic. They're a psychopath, and we lock them up and we give them treatment because their power of discerning what that objective moral law says is handicapped. Does that answer the question? All right. Anyway, moving on to the atheist's arguments against God's existence. Now, quite frankly, there really aren't that many arguments against God's existence. You'll find that quite often the atheist's main complaint is that there just isn't any evidence for God's existence. I don't have any good reasons to believe in God, and so I'm quite happy to remain an atheist. But if you have the arguments down that we've studied in this class, that's not going to apply to you. Because is it true that there is no evidence for God's existence? No, that's not true. So when the atheist looks at you and says, well, there's just no evidence for God's existence, you can look at him with a shocked expression and say, really? Is that what you think? Why, I can think of at least 4 good reasons to think that God exists. And at that point, the atheist is going to have to say something like, oh yeah, like what? And then boom, you're off and running. God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe. God is the best explanation for the beginning of the universe. God is the best explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe for life. And God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties. And very often, just sharing that list with the atheist is going to be enough to answer his primary complaint that there is no evidence for God's existence. And you'll find, and of course, if he wants to hear more about those individual reasons to believe that God exists, then you can go into each one individually. But I think you'll find that generally speaking, most atheists are so ill-equipped with dealing with this issue that the response that you're going to get back the most is, well, that's no evidence for God's existence. There's no evidence for God's existence. Yes, Ed?
Just kind of touched on it just there. I talking with people about this, their definition of evidence is going to be different.
Okay.
And that's where you're going to be spending your time.
Yeah. Yeah, they have a standard for proof that's something like, show me with 100% certainty that God exists. And we're not arguing for 100% certainty at all.
Along with that, from a Christian's point of view, here's what Jesus said to Thomas. Jesus said to him, because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who do not see and yet believe. Jesus intended to point out that ultimately people are going to believe on me because they've read through the information and come to an agreement that it's a belief. Then it's not going to be Jesus is put into a test tube
Yeah.
and weighed and measured and calculated, and science says, yeah, he exists.
Yeah. So that's typically what you're going to hear from the atheist. They're just going to say over and over again, like a mantra, well, there is no evidence for God's existence. It's as if they think that saying it over and over again will eventually make it true. And so what you've got to do is you got to get them to engage with the argument. You can say, well, I guess you don't find my arguments convincing. So tell me, which of my premises do you reject and why? And the atheist is likely to say something like, well, I think religion is all in your head, or religion has done more harm than good in this world. But you don't let them get you distracted. Tell them, I understand that that's how you feel, but you said there was no evidence for God's existence, and here I've presented some evidence. So please tell me, which of my premises do you reject and why? Try to get them to engage with the argument. And eventually you may reach a point where you have to say something like, you know what, I'm thinking that your rejection of God is not an intellectual rejection of God, but an emotional rejection of God. Tell me the real reason why you don't think that God exists. And at that point, you've moved on from apologetics into personal counseling. So that's the first response that we can give to the atheist response, that there is no evidence for God's existence. That's not true. There is evidence for God's existence, and here it is. But furthermore, even if it were true, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is a phrase that's beloved among criminologists. If you are trying to solve a murder and you have no evidence that it was the butler that committed the murder, does that mean that you can rule them out as a suspect? Does that mean that you can rule them out as a suspect? No. You have to have an alibi. You have to have some kind of positive evidence that shows that they did not commit the crime before you can rule them out as a suspect. And so to rule out God's existence, the atheist is going to need some kind of evidence to show that he does not exist. Absence of evidence isn't enough. Is that a hand? Yeah.
And the sheer mental gymnastics of science, because 90% of science seems to be looking for the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
They know something must exist because that would explain this happening.
Right.
So much of what they find is because there was an absence of something.
Right.
They had to find where that was.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.
And then when it comes to God, they're like,
Nope. Good. Anything else on answering the atheist's most common complaint, there is no evidence for God's existence? All right, so after this, the next one that you'll hear most often is you can't prove a universal negative. They admit that they don't have any evidence for God's existence, but they try to put a different spin on it. They'll say no one can prove a universal negative. Now, a universal negative is a statement that denies something of all members of a class. So, for example, no man is running would be a universal negative. Or no fish are birds. That's a universal negative. And since there is no God is a universal negative, and they say you can't prove a universal negative, then that means we don't have to prove atheism. So we don't have to have any proof or any evidence that God does not exist. So first of all, that's not true. You can prove a universal negative. And this is very easy to see because all you need is a universal negative that involves something self-contradictory, like saying there are no square circles, or there are no married bachelors. those things are obviously true, right? Right, those things are obviously true, and you don't even have to prove those things. So it's not true that you can't prove a universal negative. You can, and it's fairly easy to give examples. But even if it were true, his claim is nothing more than an admission that you can't prove atheism. If it's true that you can't prove a universal negative, and there is no God is a universal negative, that means that atheism can't be proven. It turns out it's the atheist who is holding to a position for which there is and can be no evidence. So if it were true that you cannot prove a universal negative, this response ought to be part of the Christian's apologetic arsenal, not the atheists. Any questions or comments on this response? All right, and then the third one that we'll see is that they'll try to revise the definition of atheism so that it's no longer the view that God does not exist, but it's merely a lack of belief in God. Atheism is not the view that there is no God, it's just a lack of belief of God. So they're saying, I'm an atheist, but I'm not saying that there isn't a God. I'm just saying that I lack a belief of God, and I don't have to prove that I lack a belief in God. So first of all, that's not true. This is not the traditional definition of atheism. Traditionally, atheism is the view or position that God does not exist, as opposed to theism, which is the view that God does exist. What they've described, their lack of belief of God, is more closely resembling the definition of agnosticism, which is the view that God may or may not exist. I don't know. But even agnosticism is still a position. It's still the viewpoint that God may or may not exist. Even if it were true, that this was the definition of atheism, it's hopeless as a definition. Because on this definition, atheism is no longer a viewpoint anymore. It's just a psychological state. And so it's neither true nor false. See, atheism under the traditional definition is the view that God does not exist, and so it is a viewpoint, and it is either true or false. But when you redefine atheism as an absence of belief of God, that's not a position anymore. That's not a viewpoint anymore. It's not true or false. It's just false. It's just a psychological state. And under this definition, even babies turn out to be atheists because they have the psychological state of lacking a belief in God. In fact, under this definition, even my dog Kaylee is an atheist because she lacks a belief in God. So this is really hopeless as a definition. Use whatever word you want. We still need a word that describes the viewpoint that God does not exist. And if you hold to that viewpoint, you're going to need some kind of evidence to defend that viewpoint. Any discussion on this one? All right, so those are our three common atheist responses that you'll hear the most. But thoughtful atheists do try to provide arguments against God's existence, and undoubtedly, the most important of these is the problem of suffering. When you consider the extent and the depth of human suffering in the world, you have to admit that it's hard to believe in God. The horrible suffering in the world certainly seems to be evidence of God's absence. I distinctly remember what it felt like when I first encountered the problem of suffering myself. Erica and I had been married for about 3 years. We'd moved into a house, and we decided that it was time that we started a family. And after months of trying, we found out that Erica was pregnant. And immediately, we went from a family of 2 to a family of 3. It was instant. And we began to love that baby immediately. And we began to imagine our future with that baby. And every night before we went to bed, we would sing to that baby. And then after 8 weeks, that baby died. And my heart did not go back to the way it was when we were a family of 2. There were still 3 very big sections, and one of them was empty. And it hurt. And it was the first time that I asked, why? God, why did you do this to us? If we weren't supposed to have a kid, that's fine. You could have kept us from getting pregnant. You could have let that baby die before we even knew it was there. But why get our hopes up like this? And I could see why when people ask those questions, the answer they might come to is, maybe it's because there's nobody there. If there were an all-loving God, he wouldn't let this happen to me. And so maybe the most reasonable explanation is that there is no God. But as students of apologetics, let's set aside how we feel about this problem and take a look at what we think about it. Because as difficult as the problem of suffering may be emotionally, that's no reason in and of itself to think that God does not exist. So in dealing with this emotionally loaded topic, it's crucial that we make a number of distinctions to keep our thinking clear. First and foremost, we have to make a distinguishment between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering. The intellectual problem of suffering concerns whether it's plausible to think that God and suffering can coexist. The emotional problem concerns people's dislike of a God who would permit suffering. And it's vital that we keep these problems distinct because they have different answers, right? The answer to the intellectual problem is very likely to seem very dry and uncaring to the person who's suffering emotionally. And the answer to the emotional problem of suffering is going to sound really superficial and weak to someone who is contemplating suffering as an abstract philosophical question. And I think that for most people, the terrible suffering in the world is really an emotional, not an intellectual problem. Their unbelief of God is born out of rejection, not refutation. They just want nothing to do with a God that would permit the horrible suffering that they experience and that they see in the world. But in order to support my claim that suffering poses mainly an emotional problem, we need to examine in detail the intellectual problem to show that it fails as a proof of atheism. Any questions or discussion at this point? All right, so let's dive into the intellectual problem of suffering. But before we do, it's important when we're discussing the intellectual problem of suffering that we keep in mind who has the burden of proof here. Now, what is a burden of proof? The burden of proof is, in a dispute, the obligation of a person to provide sufficient warrant for their position. The burden of proof is it means that you have the responsibility in justifying your position on a dispute. So in a dispute, who is it that holds the burden of proof? For example, if I came up to Jeff and said, Jeff, yesterday I caught a fish that was this big. Now, is Jeff obligated to believe that I caught a fish this big until he can prove that I didn't? Or is he warranted in suspending his belief until I can prove that I did catch a fish this big? It's on me, right? I'm the one who's making the claim. I'm the one who's got to provide the evidence. I have the burden of proof in such a situation. And there's even a Latin phrase for this, and I'm not even going to pretend that I know how to pronounce this, but it means the burden of proof rests on the one who says, not on the one who denies. So in the previous 4 lessons, we were considering arguments for God. We were the ones who were making the truth claim that God exists, and so we had the burden of proof. And as we looked at those 4 arguments, did we bear our share of the burden of proof? Did we provide a lot of evidence to think that our position was correct? Yeah, we did. But now we're considering arguments for atheists. So what we want to hear from the atheist is some arguments against God, and it's up to him to shoulder the burden of proof. He needs to give us arguments with premises leading to the conclusion that God does not exist. Because too often, what atheists will do is they will try to shirk their burden of proof onto the Christian. They'll ask a question like, give me some good reason for why God permits the suffering that we see in the world. And then they'll just sit back and play the skeptic at whatever explanation the Christian tries to offer for God's permitting the suffering. And the atheist winds up having to prove nothing. Now, this might be a clever debating tactic on the atheist's part, but it is intellectually dishonest and philosophically illegitimate. So don't allow the atheist to shirk his intellectual responsibilities. He's the one who is claiming that God's existence is either impossible or improbable. So it's up to him to give us some arguments to support his premises. And it's our turn to play the skeptic and try to poke holes in whatever evidence he provides that God cannot exist. But we need to insist that the atheist bear his share of the burden of proof. Yes, Ed?
Just a question along that line. Obviously, if the atheist presents there's no God because of the problem of suffering, and we come back and say, well, God had a purpose for suffering in such and such cases.
Mm-hmm.
Haggai, for example,
Mm-hmm.
Hosea, and some of the others who suffered as prophets. God had a reason he wanted them to experience what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Is that poking holes, or is that giving a negative response to their problem?
Yeah. So it is poking holes, right? We are saying that God and suffering can coexist because God has good reasons to permit the suffering. But then at that point, we are making a truth claim. And so he gets to tell us to support the truth of that claim. And we're going to talk about how to sort through those two things as we look at the intellectual argument. So hold on to that thought. Anybody else? All right, one more distinction that we need to make when discussing the intellectual problem of suffering is the distinction between the logical version and the evidential version. The logical version of the problem of suffering states that it is completely impossible for both God and suffering to exist. And the evidential version of the problem states that the suffering that we experience in the world renders God's existence improbable. It's not likely that God exists. Now, of these two versions, one of them is making a very strong claim, and the other one is making a more modest claim. The logical version is claiming that it's completely impossible for both God and suffering to exist, and that is a very strong claim to make. Whereas the evidential version says that it's improbable that both God and suffering exist. This is a more modest version. And we'll see that those two versions of the problem have different levels of burden of proof that the atheist is going to have to support. And so since there is such a big difference between the logical version and the evidential version, when we talk to the atheist about the intellectual problem of suffering, first we ought to find out which version of the problem he is supporting. So just ask him, are you saying that it's completely impossible that both God and suffering exists, or are you saying that it's improbable that both God and suffering exists? Now, most of the time, the atheist isn't going to know because they haven't thought about the question, and so you might have to explain the difference to them in order to help them figure out which viewpoint they are supporting. And depending on which version they tell you that they're supporting is going to change your answer to the problem. So let's take a look first at the logical version of the problem of suffering. The logical version claims that the following two statements are logically inconsistent. Suffering exists and God exists. They're saying that God and suffering cannot both exist at the same time. They are like the unstoppable force and the immovable object. If one exists, then the other cannot exist. If there's an unstoppable force, then there cannot be an immovable object. And if there's an immovable object, then there cannot be an unstoppable force. And they're saying that if suffering exists, then there cannot be a God. And if God exists, then there could not be suffering. Those two things are logically incompatible. But the question is, why think that that's the case? Because one is not the negation of the other. What is the atheist's argument to think that God and suffering cannot exist? Well, most of the time they don't have an argument. Really, what they'll say is suffering exists, so God can't exist. And so if you were to put what they say into a syllogism, it would look like this. We live in a world with suffering, therefore God does not exist. Now, what's the problem with this argument? Yes, Gabby? Well, that we'll get to that in just a second, but there's a bigger problem with this argument. Why isn't this a good argument? There's not a premise 2. This isn't a logically valid argument, right? This doesn't follow any of the P's and Q's that we talked about. And so, at this point, it's going to be helpful for both the atheist and for us to draw out whatever hidden premises he must be assuming to make this argument work. Because as it is, it's not logically valid. So what we can do is we can take those premises 1 and 2, and we can move them down to 4 and 5. And we can bring out some of those hidden premises that the atheist must be assuming. The first of which is, an all-powerful God could bring about any possible world. An all-powerful God could bring about any possible world. And that would include a world without suffering, right? Premise 2, an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. An all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. Okay? So premise 1, an all-powerful God could bring about any possible world that he wanted, including worlds without suffering. 2, an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. And then the conclusion would be, therefore, if an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, we would live in a world without suffering. So just looking at 1, 2, and 3, now we have a logically valid argument. An all-powerful God could bring about any possible world. An all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering. Therefore, if an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, we would live in a world without suffering. That is the type of world that God would have and could have brought about, and so that's what we should be seeing. And now the conclusion of this argument becomes the first premise in a whole new argument. So number 3, if an all-powerful, all-loving God existed, we would live in a world without suffering. 4, we live in a world with suffering. 5, therefore, an all-powerful, all-loving God does not exist. Now we have a logically valid argument. We have an argument leading to the conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. And since it's a logically valid argument, that means the conclusion necessarily follows from the truth of the premises. So what question do we need to ask at this point? Are those premises true? Very good. Thank you, Gabby. Are those premises true? So let's take a look at those 2 hidden premises that we just drew out, starting with number 1. An all-powerful God could bring about any possible world. And I want you guys to tell me, is that true? Is it true that an all-powerful God could bring about any possible world? Raise your hand if you think that it is true. Raise your hand if you think if it's not true. Ooh, you got some naysayers in here. It's not necessarily true. Before I tell you why, first let me reestablish that the version of the problem of suffering that the atheist is taking on here makes a very strong claim. He's saying that it's logically impossible for both God and suffering to coexist. And so what that means is in order for this argument to fail, all we need is a single possibility that would make it possible that both God and suffering exist. And so if we can find a single possibility in which premise 1 isn't true, then that means the whole argument fails. He's making a very strong claim here, and so it only takes a little tiny chink to make the whole thing crumble. So an all-powerful God can't necessarily bring about any possible world, and here's why. Being all-powerful does not give God the ability to do the logically impossible. For example, something logically impossible would be a round square or a married bachelor. Those things are logically impossible. There is no such thing as a round square. That is, it's impossible by definition. And at the same time, there is no such thing as a married bachelor. That's an impossibility by definition. And God does not have the ability to bring about the logically impossible because there is no such thing as the logically impossible. Those are just logically inconsistent combinations of words. Now, if at this point the atheist says that God does have the ability to bring about the logically impossible, then the problem of suffering just evaporates immediately. Because if God can do the logically impossible, then he can just bring it about that both suffering exists and God exists, even though it's logically impossible, and there's no problem anymore. So the atheist has to agree that being all-powerful doesn't give you the ability to do the logically impossible. And here's why that's important. If it's possible that free will exists, there may be some worlds that are unfeasible for God to bring about. Suppose God wanted to bring about a world that has as many people as the actual world, and we all have free will, and for that world to have gone on as long as this one has, and yet nobody sinned. Everybody freely cooperated with God's desires. Now, such a world might be logically possible, but given free will, it may not be feasible for God to bring about, because it's not possible for God to make someone do something freely. It is logically impossible to make someone do something freely. And so those in that world that have free will might not cooperate with God's desires. And if they truly have libertarian free will, then that world that God wants to bring about may not be feasible for him to bring it about, even though it's logically possible. So there is a possibility that premise 1 is not true. It may be that there are worlds that are infeasible for God to bring about. Yes, Bob?
An all-powerful God can take your free will away.
That's true.
When you start saying God can't do something, aren't we losing stuff on the back end from our previous argument?
No.
Basically we said God was so powerful, he spoke the universe
Yep.
into existence, and now you're saying he can't do something.
I get what you're saying, and I know it sounds blasphemous, so give me a chance to explain here. If God were to take away our free will, that would be a different world. Here the atheist is making the claim that God can bring about a world in which everybody does have free will, and yet nobody sins. And I'm saying that world, there's a very good possibility that world is just infeasible for God to bring about. And if God did take away our free will, that would be a different world. Does that make sense? God could always take away our free will if he wanted to.
That means he could bring about a possible world.
Right, but could God bring about a world in which everybody has free will and freely chooses to never sin?
That's not what that says.
That would be a possible world, and the atheist is making the claim that God can bring about any possible world. So that would be one of them. Can God do that? Can God bring about a world in which everybody has free will and yet freely chooses to follow him? Maybe not. There may be any number of worlds that are infeasible for God to bring about because the people with free will inside them might not freely cooperate with what God wants them to do. And it's logically impossible to make someone do something freely. If God were to make them do anything, that would be taking away their free will, and that would be a different world. Yes, Jeannie?
I was going to say, it's not possible for God to go against his nature.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he is love, so he cannot do something that's unloving. There are things that God cannot do.
Yeah, and I agree. That would all of the things, like if I say that God, I said last week that God could not command child abuse. Not because I'm limiting God, but because that's against his very nature. It would be logically impossible for God to command child abuse because God's commands necessarily flow from his character. Yes, Anne?
I raise my hand and say that he could bring about any possible world. And I believe that is absolutely true, so long as, he brings it about, but there's a missing variable, is can somebody else mess it up?
Right. Yeah, and a world in which someone messes it up is a possible world in and of itself. And so that would be, if God was trying to bring about a world in which nobody did mess it up, that world now becomes infeasible for God to bring about because he gave the people in it free will. We are a little over time, so I have got to wrap this up. Next week, we're going to take a look at the truth of premise 2. So I want you to be thinking about the truth of premise 2. Is it true that an all-loving God would prefer a world without suffering? Tonight, by way of invitation, I'm going to do something a little different. Of course, every time we meet together, we want to make sure that it's clear that you have the opportunity to come forward and commit your life to Jesus and be baptized into his body through the waters of baptism. But tonight, we talked about suffering. And I just want to extend the invitation to anybody here that if there's something that you're suffering through right now, let somebody know. Talk to somebody about it. It's easier to get through it together. And if it's something that we as a congregation can help you with, I would invite you to come forward tonight now as we stand and as we sing.